I just wanted to welcome you on behalf of the Department of Spanish, Portuguese and Latin American Studies at King's. We're very happy to be able to support this book launch today. The English translation of sots, feréstecs, translated by Alan Yates and published by Dedalus Books. We've got a varied program organised for this evening. It's going to begin with a video which is going to set the mood for the evening, and then we'll be followed by a panel talk. But we'll start with the so we may need to dim the lights at the back and turn them off.
And so, one afternoon, some local people out in the woods caught sight from there of a priest. Middle-aged he looked to be, coming up from the direction of the Oliveras farmhouse, astride a mare, and accompanied by an old man and his wife, who must have been his servants. The news travelled in whispers from one ear to the next. He must have done something really wrong, and he's been brought up here to purge his sins. So why am I being buried alive here? They are burying you here as a punishment, came the reply from the depths of the abyss. You, in your vanity and presumption, try to dazzle people with marvellous, clever ideas. You wanted to resurrect an ancient philosopher, a wise man from centuries ago, who had been completely forgotten by everybody. It was your vanity that made you pry into the sealed tomb that his writings had become, disturbing the mould on his books, their pages riddled with wormholes and sinful ideas. Out of vanity, you claimed that universal truth was to be found there, and, as your arrogance became ever stronger, you attempted to turn that heretic into a saint. That is why you have been exiled to this land of the dead, inundated with darkness and sorrow. His head was filled with the restless phantoms, the remnants of his earlier delirium, and so every night he watched in the darkness the silent procession of the night hours. In the stillness that surrounded him, he had become accustomed to distinguishing the faintest, most feeble sounds. So he spent long hours listening in the dark, as though he were trying to decipher the unknown language of the thousands of beings and things which speak or sigh, which yelp or weep meekly in the great silence of the night.
rather dark. It's a very bright day. So we're now going to have a panel discussion. On our panel, I think we're going to start off with, it's with Eric, isn't it?
Yes.
So Eric Lane, the director of Daedalus Books, and then afterwards Eva? No, and then afterwards John. We'll start off with Eric.
I'd like to thank you all for coming. When it finished, I thought, oh, we can all go home now, but I'm afraid we can't. We've actually done 2 books from Catalan. I'd actually forgotten the first one. We did Raimon Laws of Blanquerna in 1987. Blanquerna has the honour, or disputed honour, of being the first novel ever published. Obviously, Raimon Lul is a tremendous figure in Catalan literature, and the Catalan Institute is named after Raimon Lul. All I can say is that Blanquerna, as a read, is quite hard work. A medieval allegory with no funny bits. And I think it sounds reflected there are no funny bits. So there's a huge gap before we got our next Catalan book, which was Dark Vales. This was offered to us by the editor Eva Bosch. I read the sample, I thought it was our kind of book. The author committed suicide, which made him our kind of author. We have a disproportionate amount of authors in our classic series who have committed suicide. I don't know why. They think maybe they get published by Daedalus in the years to come. So it was a natural fit. We were able to get a grant from the Raimon Lul Institute. I didn't realise that the Catalan were more enamoured with bureaucracy than even the Spanish. If I'd known that, I don't know if we would have started on this project. But the paperwork was a lot of it. The book, I think, owes a lot to the tenacity of the editor. Eva Bosch has tremendous passion, tremendous energy, and she drives everyone crazy, and she can't understand why the whole world does not love this book, and we're not queuing up to go off to the mountains to see where it was written, and then to go home and tell everybody what a wonderful place it was and what a wonderful book. Eva made video. I said, oh, should we have a video? She made videos, and next thing I know, there was the video. I said, oh, can we have some words in there, the words? So, in my experience, it's very unusual to have someone, you ask them something, and it's done. And Eva said, oh, we must have an event. And I said, fine, but we must have an audience. And I said, events without audiences aren't worthwhile. So 2 years after publication, we have our event, and thankfully we have a very good audience, all down to Eva. Eva said she was going to get some flyers. I said, oh, well, 50, how many did you do? 1,000. You see the difference, you know, sort of, we're on a different planet, you know, sort of, and in a way you need this enthusiasm. We sent out review copies. I think only the Church Times reviewed the book to begin with. Then Atheist Spirituality, you can see its sort of attraction. But by total badgering, even got a review of the Times City supplement, so, you know, gave it some respectability. But I don't think the book needs respectability. I think it's a very strong story. It's a very human story. And I think that it's a good advert for Catalan literature. I think the translator did a first-rate job. Catalan, I think, is a small place, but very unusual for the intensity and the passion. I knew nothing about Catalan culture till I went to Barcelona as a student. And I was amazed that everyone I met thought Catalonia was the greatest place in the world, and the Catalans were the world's greatest people. And Barcelona was the world's greatest city, which all three struck me as surprising viewpoints. But having met more Catalans, they all seem to have the same view. So who am I to disagree with them? So all I think is that it is a book that adds something to European literature, and that's all we ask. So I say thank you for Eva for her great energy, and I'm sure she's only too keen to say something to you now.
Sorry, the person who's going to say something to you now is me. Doesn't matter. We'll hear from Eva later. Can we have some Federico from like there? So you can see some of these images. What I'm going to do is to run through 3 names. You've heard 2 of them already mentioned, and 1 movement to try and contextualize this novel slightly. You're going to hear extracts of it later, if my voice holds out as well, and that'll give you some of the flavour that you've already heard and indeed seen from the video. The coincidence of my speaking about this is simply because, apart from Raimon Casellas, I knew the other people, had met them, and with to one at least feel quite close. The movement, this movement modernisme, with which the novel is associated, indeed that TLS Times Literary Supplement review 3 weeks ago actually said, the reviewer said, Matthew Tree said, that the novel Dark Vales was the representative, the most representative example of literary modernisme, which can be disputed, but is the reason for my trying to locate this novel within that movement, within modernisme. Usually, the movement modernisme, which means modernism and doesn't mean modernism in the sense that it's the Catalan version, but it's nothing to do with literary European modernism in a direct sense. It's usually associated with art and architecture above all. And it did have a literary representative and a theatrical set of representatives, but it's most known really through the architecture of somebody like Gaudí. Here's the Palau Güell in Barcelona, Casa Milà, examples of it. And sometimes when you look up, you see that the version of what critics say is modernism in English is Art Nouveau, to use an English phrase. The actual ideology behind modernism, and you can talk about an ideology behind this movement, is more to do with modernizing the Catalan nation and representing it as such, in other words, asserting its national identity. That means bringing it up to date, not making it look fusty, making it part of the currents of European culture, but at the same time alluding to the past. So that's why, in ideological terms, a lot of this art, another example by Gaudí and Domenico Montaner's house in Reus, there on the right. That's why a lot of this art and a lot of the architecture is so exciting and actually quite eccentric, because it really is striving for a kind of originality and doing it consciously in national terms. This is, in other words, this is Catalan architecture, this is Catalan art, as we'll see in a second. One of the examples of modernisme in painting is Santiago Rusiñol. And Rusiñol is an interesting character because he's also a playwright and writer as well as an accomplished painter. And for those of you more interested in painting, you'll see, if you haven't already seen examples of this, that it is located in between styles, in between symbolist, surrealist, symbolist, not quite impressionist, but styles that perhaps are elusive to realism as well. I mean, when you think of a painter like Courbet working earlier as well in France, but the colours then take you to a different realm. Some beautiful, beautiful paintings. Rossignol, interestingly, spent a lot of time in Mallorca as well, and a lot of his paintings are there now. It has to be said that one current of Modernisme, although one ramification, if you like, of Modernisme, although it was consciously projecting an artistic and a culture for Catalonia, one current of it was very ironic, and that's one of the ways we can look at this novel, actually, Dark Vales, a novel that really is about Catalan area, Catalan countryside, but if you take this as some sort of nationalist propaganda, you're going to be quite disappointed because of the portrait actually painted of this area 40 kilometers away from Barcelona. I mentioned Barcelona, and one of the big projections, if you like, the impetus for Modernisme was in 1888, the Universal Exhibition that was held in Barcelona in 1888 and really put Barcelona on the map officially as a modern capital. I say capital provocatively, obviously it was not a capital, but it's the capital of Catalonia. And most people locate the period of Modernisme from that year, or slightly earlier, but usually 1888 to 1910 or 1920, but usually 1910 it's said to come to end as a very loose movement. But Barcelona at this point is industrially developed, and throughout its history, really from the beginning of printing, and then the 300-year to 400-year gap has happened in the history of Catalan culture, really is a publishing capital as well, which is extremely important. And the number of books published in Barcelona still rivals or goes beyond those books published, the quantity of books published in Madrid, and was the case at this point at the turn of the century. Raimon Casellas, another painter associated with Modernisme, seen as a Modernista. What we're seeing here is the sketch of the author of Casellas, Raimon Casellas, by Raimon Casellas. Okay, here he is, and a few details about him. Although Eva's going to speak a bit more and also look at the novel in a bit more detail. He can be seen to incarnate Catalan Modernisme. Why? Well, look at his dates, yeah, and also his activity as art critic, political commentator and writer. As an art critic, to situate him in a European context, he travels to Paris, to France, and he writes and interested in the latest developments. Art, a lot of his quite important essays are on people like Plus de Chabannes or Whistler, for example. He's a promoter of a certain sort of innovation in painting, in 19th century painting. And this is seen as a need for updating Catalan culture as well, which puts him in an ideological, political frame. And as a writer, he's fascinating because his writing is in between this criticism, journalism, and fiction. Yep. And the fiction that he wrote, he didn't write so much of it, but the short story form, as well as the novel, comes into its own for him when he makes a transition. And that transition is associated, interestingly enough, with a political transition, and it occurs in 1899. It's when he takes on the editorship of this newspaper, La Veu de Catalunya, which is really attached to a political party which is the most important, really, party for the renascent Catalan nationalism of the period. And indeed, fragments of novels start to appear in the newspaper before they come out in that form. And you can see that actually in the form of the novel Dark Vales. The second person who comes into play here, apart from the author, and really the person to whom we owe an enormous debt of gratitude is Jordi Castellanos, because Jordi Castellanos was the person who dug up the novel, and Casellas especially, in the 70s and the 1980s, contextualized him. He really made the literary phenomenon of modernisme his field, but he was so informative that he contextualized Casellas and modernisme in a way that now becomes an obligatory reference for anybody talking about the novel. And in fact, if you look at the translation, you'll see the translation is dedicated to Castellanos, who died, as you can see, recently, and knew about it, but he didn't see the translation come to light. The other relevant part, and one of the reasons that Castellanos was so interested in Casellas, was because he was from around that area, this village, Tagamen. He ascended to Barcelona because that's where he studied then, initially at the University of Barcelona. And then there's even a British connection here, because from 1970 to 72 he was a lector of Catalan and Spanish at Durham. Interesting period to be teaching Catalan if you think that it's still during the Francoist period, so it's still really semi-prohibition, but yeah, it's being taught by Catalans to people studying at British universities. And then he goes back to Barcelona and he becomes a professor at the Universitat Autónoma de Barcelona, Autonomous University of Barcelona. He's an academic, man of enormous sensitivity. What you see there in the photo is one of the journals that was enormously important, because a bit like Casellas, he was extremely politically committed as well. He was a strong Catalan nationalist. And this was a review that he co-founded, Os Marges, which is still going and is enormously important for Catalan literary culture. There are a couple of his books that we published, more, and they're more unpublished material that will come out, we are told. But you can see the first one, which was his doctoral thesis, was Raimon Casellas on modernisme, so we pay homage to him in this presentation and in the appearance, actually, of the book, the translation itself. And finally, we come in personal homage to Alan Yates. Some of you will know. Alan really pioneered Catalan studies in this country and really the English-speaking world, because he's known to many people because he wrote a long, long time ago the first version of Teach Yourself Catalan. The idea that you could have a book called Teach Yourself Catalan in the 1970s was really unheard of. Why do you have this Teach Yourself a language doesn't even have a country? But he did write it single-handedly, and it went into several editions and still going, and there are different forms of it, and he's written several other language manuals, but at the same time he's a literary scholar, and having been born in Northampton, then went to study at Cambridge, did his doctorate at Cambridge and is emeritus professor at Sheffield now, and there are a couple of his publications, including his doctoral thesis, you can see published in Catalan, Una generació sense novella, a generation without a novel, which is a provocative title, which was actually a quotation, ironic quotation, given by a poet, Carlos Riba, and it's a reaction to that idea. Alan was interested in Casellas from an early period, but never really came to terms with the quality of the novel until he translated it by his own admission. And it's an amazing adventure of a translation. It's not a long novel, but the difficulties in translation are enormous, because the Catalan that you read in this novel has a huge rustic lexicon that many contemporary Catalans, at least if they live in Barcelona, don't know. They just don't know the words. Some of the slang, the colloquialisms, as slang tends to date very quickly, are sometimes incomprehensible to certain Catalan speakers. And it's also very difficult to gauge the tone of what you do with a lot of these phrases and a lot of the stylistic traits of Casellas in the novel, because it goes in between the colloquial and the poetic, and that's one of the tensions in the language of the novel that Alan really has managed to convey brilliantly. Again, coming back to the TLS review by Matthew Tree, appeared in early January, there's a whole paragraph dedicated actually to the translation, which you couldn't really hope more for as a translator. I speak as a translator myself. It's quite a compliment, and those are complementary views that are voiced there. So with that, I pass on to Eva, who's going to talk about a bit about the novel, and I'm going to try and read some extracts to you.
After what has been said, it will be hard to overstate the importance of sots feréstecs and the excellence of the translation. Thank you very much, John and Eric, for being here tonight and for sharing your ideas with us. I would also like to thank Dr. Federico Bonaddio and Dr. Eliza Sampson Veredella of the Department of Spanish, Portuguese and Latin American Studies for hosting us tonight at KCL. My most sincere thanks also to Institut Raimon Casellas for their generous grant, and particularly to Mercedes Stella, Director of the London Institute, for all her unconditional support that, together with Anna Vives, former Director of the Anglo-Catalan Society, have given me. Likewise, I would like to thank Eric Lane and the team of Daedalus for publishing the book. And last but not least, thank you to pianist Maite Aguirre, who is coming later on tonight to play for us a selection of Catalan modernist music. The images that you are seeing, or that hopefully you will see, projected on the wall, show the different locations mentioned in the book. They were taken during an excursion that I took part alongside the philologist Jordi Castellanos in July 2011. Jordi was born in the neighboring village of Tagamanent, and as has been mentioned, was the preeminent expert on the work of Raimon Casellas. Sadly, he died in October the following year. Both this presentation and the translation of the book are dedicated to his memory. In this talk, I will try to explain why I consider sots feréstecs an important novel, not only because of its literary merits, but because of the key position that it occupies in the history of the Catalan modernist movement, as John explained, modernism. I will give you my response to the characters and the plot, and I will also briefly comment on the process of translation, concluding with the reading of 4 small extracts from the book. Up till now, except for the translation into German by Eberhard Vogel in 1909, the novel of sots feréstecs by Casellas has remained in oblivion. Beyond the circles of the specialists in Catalan literature, Casellas is not known outside Catalonia. It is difficult to understand why the work of this important writer is still unknown internationally. The project of translating this book into English was initiated by me and carried out thanks to the outstanding work of Emeritus Professor of Catalan Alan Yates, who, as John has explained, has written numerous articles and books about our language and literature. It is important to stress that without him, this book would not have been possible. Casellas' novel is a masterpiece of literature. Dr. Yates' translation is a masterpiece of translation. My contribution to the venture derives from the fact that I was born and brought up in the village of Dumany-Figueró, in Vallès Oriental, where the book is set. The project was born from the strong desire to give this brilliant work of Catalan literature the opportunity to be read internationally in translation. Dark Vales saw the light in February 2014, and the book can be bought on Amazon as well as in most bookshops in London. Copies are also available here tonight for £9.99. Well, sots feréstecs had a great impact on me because of the universal truth it contains and because of Casellas' powerful use of the Catalan language. During Franco's dictatorship, Spanish culture underwent a terrible repression, and only censored literature was allowed. Needless to say that Basque, Galician and Catalan literature suffered an even worse fate than Castilian. As an adolescent, I knew about Casellas' novel and had read some extracts from it. But as with Don Quixote, I had to wait to be an adult to truly appreciate it. A dear friend introduced me to the novel in Barcelona during Christmas 2009. I finished reading it on board the plane back to the UK. The effect was powerful. Every corner of the book and every character became alive in my mind, charging into the world of my childhood like a wild bull. In his narrative, Casellas portrayed the dark side of rural Catalonia, describing the landscape in a way that was painful to read because of its truthfulness. How could he know so well the darkness of the sots, for instance, or the smell of wet earth during autumn, the particular patches of ochre light at early dusk hitting the white walls of the farms and manors of Montmany, the ravines around Oliveras Olvillar, the ghostly overgrown wheat of the Church of San Paolo, or the threatening shadows of the burning cliffs. Such accuracy could have only come from a local. He not only describes the misery and poverty that existed at the end of the 19th century, but he made me feel it on my own flesh. Casellas understood the psychological impact of the landscape on its inhabitants. A few weeks ago, I visited the valleys of Valtorta and Gasulla in Castellón, near Valencia, an extraordinary landscape full of rock shelters and caves, with paintings that narrate the lives of the valley's inhabitants in Neolithic times. The images indicate that these people had a burning desire to survive and fight adversity at all costs, the kind of spirit that Father Llazza, the main character of the novel, would have liked for his surly, downtrodden woodlanders. But the differences in the psychology of the inhabitants could be explained by geology. The valleys of Valtorta and Gasulla are wide open, in contrast to the deep, dark vales of Figueroa. I decided, therefore, to assume responsibility for translating this Catalan treasure into English. I would be like the ox-driven cart that Ruida describes in his book La Parada. If you're not in a hurry, there is nothing like a cart. A cart can carry a cathedral, and if one cart isn't enough, you can use 2 or 3 or 50. Build a road from here to the moon, give me time and patience, and I can deliver the moon to the main square. The effort of the translator is comparable to the work of a cart driver. Little by little, words are chosen until the translated text becomes for the foreign reader a mirror reflecting in their language the content of the book as intact as it is humanly possible. My Catalan from Vallès Oriental and the detailed memories of the village of my childhood would assist me in this process. Having said that, I was fully conscious that to bring the moon to the main square, I had the need of a true expert. To convince Dr. Yates was not easy. He, better than anyone, was conscious of the great difficulty behind a work of such magnitude. Luckily, Jordi Castellanos helped me to persuade him, and in 2011, we started the slow process of translation. The Catalan language is full of monosyllables. That makes the language very musical. Unlike the German or Dutch languages, very rarely do we link one-syllable words together to produce a long word. This musicality in the hands of a good writer can create prose and poetry, but equally, if used superficially, the effect can be grotesque and childish. Diminutives are also very common in the language, and their use can easily create smarmy, sentimental, and gross associations. Casellas uses both elements skillfully, creating a personal language comparable to what Federico García Lorca or Gabriel García Márquez would do years later with the Castilian language. Father Llazza is the artist against the world, the solitary individual whose voice of dissent is about to be silenced by his atavistic parishioners. Roda-soques is the other main character in the book. She is the hoe of the woodlanders, the prostitute of rural Catalonia, a mesmerizing woman who has no fear of hell. She has very little to do with the women of the street in the urban environment described by Zola in his novels. The slut of La Pedralba is like a surly wolf that frightens the herd, or like a wild goat climbing up and down the rocks. For the novel priest, Roda-soques is the devil, but she is also the woman that the female woodlanders fear or even envy. She is the archetype of Eve, responsible for the downfall of man. It is particularly interesting that 5 years after the publication of the sots feréstecs, the painter Pablo Picasso went to Gozo, a small village in the Lleida province in Catalonia, where he found his own wild woodlanders, whom he drew and painted extensively. The works he made in Caltampanada Hostel made it possible for him to look at African sculptures in a new light. I often think that the 5 women in the painting Les Demoiselles d'Avignon with which Cubism started, are 5 liberal-minded Roda-soques ready to forge their own destiny. I believe Casellas was a visionary, like Picasso. Father Llachza is a priest exiled to a village full of gloom and sadness, as punishment for his attempts to canonize a heretic. Llachza is the hero ready to fight against the monster that enslaves the mind of man. A Nietzschean Superman who is control of his virtues and create of his own destiny. The death of the German philosopher coincided with the birth of a new century that promised great changes. In Barcelona in 1892, a movement evolved known as Modernismo. It was a political and cultural movement aiming at changing Catalan society. Not merely an aesthetic option, but a complete ideology. It was important to look ahead to progressive Europe and sought to create a new form of art that would mold a new kind of society. Historian Joan Lluís Marfany, in his study on modernism, mentions a dialogue that encapsulates the spirit of the movement. Published in the magazine Vales, the dialogue was between Jaume Brossa and Santiago Rossinyol, both writers. The later, as you have seen, was also a painter, and younger than Casellas. They describe Catalonia as being in a state of malaise. They compare it to a Jewish market, a Sancho Panza, a prude and a liar that no young mind could be interested in. They call for a modern, outward-looking country with an autonomous educational system and liberal attitudes that would turn Catalonia into a beacon, a small cultural corner in the world. Nietzsche's influence was at its peak just before the explosion of modernism, and he almost certainly influenced the movement, as it was the Catalan poet Maragall who translated and brought Nietzsche to Spain, and therefore the modernistas had his writings at their disposal. The novel Sots feréstecs was published in 1901, initiating, as Jordi Castellanos explains, one of the most brilliant periods of Catalan literature. This book was the first Catalan novel that emerged from the ideas of naturalism, as Casellas explains in the prologue of Los Multituds, the book that he published 5 years later. According to naturalism, humanity is trapped inside a hostile universe from which it is impossible to escape. Mankind is constrained by its genetic heritage and its surroundings. The submission of the individual to the collective will is a favorite theme in Casellas' writing. According to the writer, the psychology of the crowd overwhelms the psychology of the individual. The behavior of the masses is as unpredictable as hurricanes or earthquakes. Casellas published the first chapter of the book in 1899 as a short story in the newspaper Veu de Catalunya. Other chapters followed until he later published the group in the single volume. His trip to Paris 6 years earlier, together with painters Rossinyol and Casellas, was a key experience in his artistic development, as it was in Paris that he had his first contact with modern art in Europe. Meanwhile, during this time in Spain, the remains of the empire were vanishing fast, and thousands of ill-prepared soldiers were falling in North Africa. It was precisely the recruitment of these soldiers in Catalonia that led to the Setmana Tràgica of 1909. More than 100 people were killed during that tragic week. A series of events that took place in Barcelona during that summer led to Casellas' suicide. He was mistaken for somebody else and fired at by a patrol of the Sumateni, the regional police. He was utterly disturbed by the regime, bearing in mind that some of his collaborators in Vales, such as Jaume Brossa, were political activists and had been imprisoned. As we know, Raimon Casellas committed suicide at dusk on All Saints' Day in 1910. He threw himself at the railings near the station of San Joan de les Abadesses, a death similar to Nietzsche's, caused by insanity. Born in 1855, Raimon Casellas lost his father when he was 9 months old. When he was 9, he entered the seminary to study Latin and humanities, and at the age of 17, he lost his mother and had to take care of the dry cleaning business of the family. In his research on Els sots feréstecs, Jordi Castellanos finds references to Casellas' childhood in his memoirs, La mort del bosc, Memòries íntimes, The death of the forest, Intimate memories. Casellas explains that he spent summer 1870 with his mother in the house of Llullà in Montmany, the setting of the novel. He recalls their fleeing from an epidemic of yellow fever that had infested Barcelona. In the same text, and particularly relevant, he talks about his tendency of feeling emotional in front of nature with these words. My imagination was loaded with chunks of verses of Virgil that I was forced to translate, and chunks of prose by Rousseau that I could only read in hiding. Man is born free, but he is everywhere in chains, says the Swiss philosopher. Casellas also viewed mankind as trapped by the society that surrounds him. For him, modernism was a campaign for the demolition of all values, and an attempt to regain man's freedom. Like the artist, Jatze contemplates the effects of poverty, misery, and the constant struggle for survival of the woodlanders, and wants to save them. First, he tries to soften and tame them with the love of God, but as his failure becomes evident, he must then resort to the wrath of God and guilt. Jordi Castellanos compares Father Jatze to Father Verdaguer, the rebel Catalan poet 10 years older than Casellas, who died a few years before him. Jatze, like Verdaguer, talks about God with the innocence of a child. Those who, like me, were brought up under strict Roman Catholic education can relate to the cathartic mysticism violently acquired through such education and erased in the same manner together with childhood. Let us now look at the book and appraise its content. I will ask John to read for you in a proper English accent 3 brief fragments from 3 different chapters, and I will make some comments after each reading. The first extract is from chapter 2, entitled The Derelict Church.
Weeks and then months went by in this way. And because privation and misery can inure mankind to anything, there came the day when both shepherds and those who worked on the land became used to the bell's silence, to that particular silence which seemed to be that of death itself. They saw cracks gradually appearing in the church walls, but they paid no particular heed. They saw a thick mat of nettles and mallow plants, sap rich and proud, spreading like a crazy, dishevelled lawn, overgrowing the narrow strip of the burial ground in the space between the priest's house and the church. But nobody took any notice. They saw ivy spreading everywhere, clinging like a blood-sucking parasite to the walls of the temple and to the stones enclosing the priest's vegetable garden, clinging even to the gnarled lower trunks of the cypresses in the cemetery, and nobody bothered about it. Only occasionally, when round by the church apse they glimpsed pairs of buzzards, circling as though in a witch's dance in mysterious wheeling movements high in the air, only then did they feel a kind of shudder. Then they crossed themselves, murmuring a strange prayer that they knew by heart in order to ward off evil.
The Church of San Paul, today in ruins, as you can see in the images, has preserved some Romanesque features. The witch-like rituals performed by the symbolic birds in the book did not exorcise the curse, and the church is in serious danger of collapse. In the book, though, Jatze rebuilds it and transforms it into a house of God, where bells toll once again. But the resurrected church becomes a burden for the woodlanders. In this Dantesque scene presented here, it is almost impossible to imagine a resurgence, a sparkle of hope. But Father Jatze is ready to leave his skin behind if necessary, to save the soul of the woodlanders. But not only will he fail, he will end up buried next to his church.
Chapter 12, Footloose. A woman called Footloose, he asked, quite bemused, but who is she, this Footloose? Those women knew only too well. Footloose was the incitement to mortal sin, the local prostitute. She was the trollop of the woodlands, who, ranging here and there through valleys and over hillsides, had men, old and young, running after her, drawn by the intense smell of fleshy delights. She attracted even some of the most decrepit old men, and even also some sickly youths who used to come over all queasy at the thought of her. When she was young and frisky, she had rarely moved away from the lowlands, because in those days she had it very easy. She could go blithely from one town or village to another, strutting her fine eye-catching skirts and brightly coloured headscarves. But later, when she lost her following in those places because she was getting wrinkled and the authorities were charging her with indecent behaviour, then she had no alternative but to go up to the hills or to go down into a secluded valley, slinking into the woods or hiding in remote gullies or finding a bolt hole for a few nights in the straw loft of a local tavern, or on other nights sleeping out in the open air.
The whole Roda-soques, like all the other characters, emerged from a chronic poverty. Roda-soques is the name of a small bird that flies around the stumps of trees. It is also the term used for an errant person who is always coming and going. Alan and I could not agree with the translation of Roda-soques because we could not find an equivalent that would please both of us. I was ready to keep the original Catalan name. Alan, on the other hand, was convinced that the word footloose, being a combination of a noun and an adjective, would facilitate the placing of the word across the text, and his choice went to print.
Chapter 15, Dark Days. On some nights, the old woman, overcome with fatigue, would flop onto the bed, only to feel, before she had even closed her eyes, drops of water falling on her head. "God, my Lord, help me," poor Mariagna would shout as she was moving to get up. And then there she was, going towards the landing with the lamp in her hands, stopping suddenly in the doorway because she thought she could hear drops falling also inside the adjoining closet. That was where their meagre clothes were kept, and she rushed to take them out of the trunk, fearing that they would get damp and mildewed. Hanging the oil lamp from a peg, she began to gather together her precious garments, but as soon as she had picked up all the clothing, ready to move it to a safer place, she realised that rain was also coming into the storehouse outside, and as that was where the year's barely sufficient supply of grain was kept, she simply did not know which way to turn or what to salvage first. It was unbearable, a desperation comparable to staring death in the face.
Giuseppe and Marianna are the priest's aging servants. They lack any emotion, and no one is suffering. They are driven entirely by a sense of duty, of doing things properly without asking why and expecting nothing in return. It is as if for them the act of living was simply a calvary towards death. They are like small, vulnerable animals, but unlike animals, they do not know how to show joy or sadness because they cannot feel them. A bit later on, when the priest begins to recover, what worries and shames the old couple above anything else is what Father Iazzo might say when he finds out that they have not been able to defend the few possessions that they had left. The old couple are a clear representation of the slave, all resignation, sacrifice, acceptance, and guilt. For the hero priest of the novel, the hardship to which the woodlanders are condemned, of having to live in the deep and dark ravines, surrounded by a range of mountains, is not the biggest calamity. For him, the greatest tragedy is that he has to accept the emotional loneliness of his failure. Casellas mentions the trousseau of Marianna kept in a trunk, a chaban, and he describes how she fears that her few sheets and pillowcases might go moldy. Using household items associated with femininity, Casellas brings the suffering of the old woman to the reader in a very intimate way. With the use of diminutives so common in the Catalan language, such as "envollumet a la mà" for the small lantern, or "la robet als braços" for the clothes that she is carrying, he creates a precise and dramatic feeling without falling into sentimentalism. To translate these terms is practically impossible. Jaya is untranslatable, and there is no English word that could be used without sentimentalizing it or without sacrificing the tender meaning of the word. The English text is excellent because Alan has managed to transform this particular tenderness into an English equivalent, equally profound but different. And I will conclude with a fourth reading of the last fragment of the same chapter, where Father Iazzo begins to feel scared. Like Zarathustra, the priest has dared to enter the world of the doorman, and until the last minute, when physically paralyzed but fully conscious, he continues to believe in the power of love to awaken his woodlanders. But the devil comes in and wins the battle.
But what is this? Tell me, what is all this? The old couple, though, instead of replying, began to whimper, with tears running down their faces. Are you crying? The priest asked the old man. I am crying, was the reply. But why? Tell me why. Because the strength has gone, Father. A new Mariagna? Because we're both useless. Oh, you poor things. You're not going to talk like that. You're tearing my soul to shreds. And as though Poleax, quite defeated, with his head sunk in his hands and with an intensely disquieting feeling under his skin, the priest reflected that the deathly loneliness of which he had earlier dreamed a vision was nothing like as cruel as the solitude which he now knew was in store for him. He was about to be abandoned by his aged companions. Their strength was at an end, and they could die at any time. And he, all alone, helpless, would be left to wander without direction like a drifting phantom in the valley of the shadow of death.
Thank you very much.
So we have about 10 minutes to open the floor to questions. If you have questions either for Eva, John or Eric. Do you have any questions? Don't be shy.
I was wondering what difference, if there is any at all, between modern movement and naturalism, because it seems very similar. Is there any such difference, or between naturalism, Zola, and this kind of modernism as I look at novel?
It's interesting because the literary influences on Catalan modernisme, contras, have a great range. And let's say in the realm of theatre, Ibsen is there, the naturalist Ibsen, but also Mitterrand, the Belgian symbolist dramatist. And in fact, Casellas acted in the premiere in the Festes Modernistes in Sitges of the L'Intrusa in Catalan. The explanation, the usual response to that is to say that Modernista goes beyond naturalism. And it goes beyond naturalism in the sense that it doesn't simply chain human beings to their environment and to their biography, but goes beyond that. So, from a nationalist perspective, there has to be that link to emphasize the nation, but on the other hand, the techniques of writing work as much through symbol as they do through explanation of environment, biography that dictate a character's behaviour. And you can see that explicitly in the novel, because in the novel there are one or two, but in fact only one chapter, where the biography of characters is explained. And it's only two characters, it's only this old couple who have their biography and therefore their behaviour totally explained in naturalist terms. But other characters, apart from being vaguely associated with the environment, namely the sort of countryside we've been looking at, and therefore being disconnected, if you like, apart from that quite vague association, they don't have their individual characters explained in that way. And the most mysterious from that point of view is the priest. Because apart from the explanation that was given in the reading, we don't actually know much about him. So that's totally unnaturalist from that point of view. Do you want to add something to that?
No, I mean, to tell you the truth, I know very little about naturalism. But I think that this novel, I mean, often talking with Jorge Castellanos, he insisted that this was not a symbolist novel. So it's a symbolist novel, it's a naturalist novel, it's not a modernist novel. So I think that the novel really covers the three. Because as you explained, I mean, yes, it is a naturalist novel in a way, but it is also a symbolist novel, and it's also a modernist novel. I mean, I get a little bit lost with these terms, you know, and for me it's an excellent novel.
Thank you, I understand. It makes sense.
Could I ask a question about the translation? You were telling me earlier that the translation to Spanish is not very good, and I was wondering whether, in the hopes that it might spread and become part of European literature, whether a French translation might be an idea, and whether that might be more, not faithful, I mean, more like Alan Yates's version of the English, because I would imagine that French and Catalan, correct me if I'm wrong, you know, has a very, yes, affinity.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't say it's a bad translation, it's a literal translation.
Yeah.
Absolutely literal. And so, you know, when you read it, if you don't know any Catalan, you got the feeling that this is not really a very good novel, because it's a literal translation. And something like this needs an awful lot of time to translate, which I think that is what Alan Yates has done. It took us 2 years to translate this, and we went through every single sentence, you know, trying to really get the feel of the book. I mean, this could, you know, someone could make a fantastic translation into Spanish, but it wouldn't be a literal translation. You know. And with the French, yes, I mean, you know, the Catalan language has a lot of similarities in grammar to the French language. And, but again, you would need an excellent translator. So I don't think it's so much the language, it's the quality of the translator. I mean, someone who's prepared to spend 2 years or 3 years doing it. I mean, nowadays this is impossible, because if someone commissions you a translation, will tell you you have to do it in 6 months or a year or whatever. I mean, Alan would have never done that, nor would have I, if there was a deadline. We started it as an experiment, you know, hoping that we would reach an end with it, which we did, and then luckily Eric decided to publish it first. But there was no limit. It could have taken 3 years, 4 years. I mean, this was a great luxury that not everybody has, you know. So my answer is, what you need is an excellent translator, and then probably it will translate very well to French.
The interesting thing is, specifically with lexicon, if you think of the connection, intimate connection of language with place in that sense, you have to think of an equivalent. Although the names and the place names remain the same, you have to think of an equivalent in the dialogue for the target language, the language you're translating into. So without quite locating it in Ambridge, there is an element of some rustic background environment that we as English speakers can associate with. And Alan's done that very well because it isn't just quaint. But you've got to think, you know, is it in France going to be the south of France, for example? Will it have to be an area where it's not in this area because of some of the vocabulary as well? And that's a difficult thing.
As far as I remember, it was sort of freeing up, in sort of push towards enlightenment in Catalonia in the beginning of the 20th century. A large part of it was anti-terror, and the clergy were very unpopular. So it struck me as quite surprising that the hero of this work is actually a priest. And also there seems to be quite a lot of spirituality in the book. I haven't read it from what you've said this evening. His sort of great ambition to rebuild his ruined church seems to be a very sort of symbol of trying to rebuild a spiritual life. But that all seems quite surprising in the context of the sort of social forces that were at work at the time.
Yes, that is very, very true. But if you think of Verdaguer, which was a writer before Casellas, I mean, he was a priest himself. Oh, I forgot to say, Casellas was trained as a priest, then eventually he didn't become. So I think Verdaguer and Casellas could be compared in that sense, because they were both people very, very connected with the church, but they looked at the church and to God in a very pure, real way. You know, this was not like, you know, the opportunistic Roman Catholic Church. These are people who really believed in what they were writing. So I think, you know, both Verdaguer and Casellas are people who really believed in God in the true meaning of the sense. Yeah? And so therefore, what he's portraying in his book, I think it is God, but also of other things too. So religion is there that goes beyond. That's the way I think.
I totally disagree.
Oh.
I mean, if you want anti-clericalism or a view that's critical of religion, I don't think God is anywhere in the book, actually. It's explicitly in the imagination of the priest. And the priest is this ambivalent character who's actually quite arrogant, who's quite cruel, who is an egotist. At the same time, he comes with supposedly good intention. But the trick and the real sophistication of the novel is that there's a slip in the narrative where things are being described, and you only realise after a paragraph that the description is coming through the mind of the priest. And that's very sophisticated from a narratological point of view, because it isn't first-person narrative. But from an ideological point of view, it starts playing tricks as well, because you realise that the reality created through the priest's vision that sometimes is presented as prescription, in fact, is totally erroneous. He hasn't got a clue what he's doing. So that's why the contrast with this prostitute and the priest, the arrival of the prostitute being parallel to the arrival of the priest, is actually, it's black, but it's quite hilarious. And the priest is so, well, he condemns his flock explicitly in such a way that you can understand why they're more interested in the prostitute. I mean, who wouldn't be? Okay? So, from that point of view, it fits entirely a critical angle that either personalizes religion, but definitely takes it away from somebody who's supposed to be a protagonist for the church. And by the way, it has to be said without spoiling the end, it's a total failure. He fails. And whether or not it's a tragic failure or a comic failure, I haven't spoiled the end yet, because that's what you can make up your mind to when you come to the final page, because that's part of the beauty of the book. You know.
Well, I see what you're saying, but I think you need to critical yet. I think, Yatza and Bertaghe, they're people who really believe in God in a very pure way. And I think that is important too. I think dismissing that, and I don't think it's fair. I mean, they are really...
And have to in a very British way, beg to differ for the moment. Because have time.
Anyway, read the book.
Yeah,
one last question. It has to be quick because we have a performance and the logistics around it mean that this final question will have to be as quick as the answer will be concise.
Did Casellas have any contact with the Federico in Provence?
Do not know.
No is a very concise answer. So listen, I want to thank very much the panelists for that. Thank you for your questions. We now have my deck in it, who's going to play, if I'm correct, it's a modernist music. Is it entitled?
Yes, I'm going to explain it right now. If you allow me to play just one chord to make sure that the volume is set before disturbing you later. Because when I tried it later, I was a bit quiet. So I've chosen 3 different pieces for you tonight. Three composers that are from this period, from the modernist period. When Eva very kindly invited me to attend, first name that dropped to my mind was Granados for obvious reasons, and that is that now this year in 2016 we are celebrating his centenary. He had a very, very tragic death, in fact. His life as well was a little bit tragic when one thinks about it. He never quite got the success he wanted to. And finally, when it seemed that he got it, in New York, where his opera Goyescas was performed at the Met, first time actually, premiere at the Met, on the way back, when he stopped here in England, and then in the boat Sussex was heading home, the boat was torpedoed, and the boat started to sink. Now, however, it gets even beyond that in the tragic sense, because it's a little bit his own superstition that he was going to die. He repeatedly and repeatedly said that in letters the days before that and the months before that all through this voyage, made him and his wife jump out of the ship, because actually the captain gave strict instructions not to do so, And in fact, the ship was moored back to the sea, and everyone who remained was safe. Granados' own chamber had not a drop of water, but tragically he perished and also did his wife. This piece is called Oriental, and it belongs to his Spanish Danzas, a piece written during his youth around the 1890s, and is very meditative, contemplative, and quite curvaceous. And I think it can also remind us a little bit of the modernist architecture in a way, and that's one of the reasons why I chose it, and I hope you enjoy it. Albéniz. He's contemporary of Granados, slightly older, and they were very close friends. They both went to Paris to study, and Albéniz was a very generous person. He settled down in Paris, much more longer than Granados, but Granados returned back to Barcelona. And so Albéniz, I'm very fond of both. But Albéniz, when he settled in Paris, he acted a little bit as a Catalan/Spanish ambassador for other young musicians that would go to Paris themselves to study. At that time, Paris was really the cultural hub in Europe, and so many musicians would go there for guidance to start up their careers. Isaac Albéniz's life was also quite eventful, but a little bit, I guess, in a way, maybe more cheerful than Granados. He was a little bit more renowned. He was a bit of a bon vivant. He developed quite a belly also in his old age. However, it's also sad. He died quite ill, and there is an anecdote as well where Granados goes to Campo Ledo to visit Albéniz in his deathbed, and he plays for him. And one of the pieces Granados plays is Mallorca from Albéniz. And one of the reasons to do so is because they had together tours in that island some years ago when they were younger, and they were very fond of each other, and it was really lovely. And well, this is a very different piece from Albéniz. It's not from that period. This also belongs to his youth, and it's called Catalunya, and I thought very befitting since we are talking about a Catalan book. And it's a little bit more strange than what it would seem at first, because even though he was Catalan and he loved his country very much, there are not that many pieces that he would devote to Catalunya itself. This belongs to the Suite Español, and it's the number 2. It's actually dedicated to his mother, who was Catalan herself. So this is Catalunya by Isaac Albéniz. Modernism. Because the Catalan musical modernism derives from the Renaissance and has a strong nationalistic feeling, a feeling as well of joining people together. And so even if both Granados and Albéniz are most known as piano composers, and they're excellent piano composers, in itself modernism, I believe, is much more of a choral movement for the people, for people to sing. During the modernism is the time where we have so many orfeones in Catalonia, so many big choral agrupations. That's where the Orfeo Catalan comes from. And actually the next composer, Lluís Millet, he was one of the co-founders of this wonderful big choir, this wonderful Orfeo that still carries to our days. El Can de la Señora was composed to a text of Pi Maragall that I heard as well Eva mentioned it beforehand, and it was composed as the hymn for this Orfeo Catalan, but nowadays it's considered like a Catalan national anthem, almost. Also, I felt befitting because the Palau de la Música was built by one of the fathers of the Catalan modernism in architecture, and it was the house, still is, of the Orfeo Catalan. So I thought everything sort of close together, and since those last two pieces have both been slightly melancholic, this is more finishing it with a bang in a way. I have to tone myself because if I play very loud, the keyboard rattles. So, but if anyone knows the words or wants to sing, please feel free. It will make me very happy, and I hope you enjoy this little bit of music. So this is El Can de la Señora by Luis Millet.
thank Maite, who's getting ready. There are logistic rubbish needs to go, so get everything packed and get off. And to thank very much our panelists, Eric, Eva, and John, and for introducing the book to us. It's not a book that I know. Catalan and modernism is not my area, so it was wonderful to learn about that today. Thanks to everybody for coming to this event. There are books on sale at the back, and there are drinks that I don't think they'll serve themselves. I think someone will come and serve them, but if not, we will open them. So I hope you'll stay with us a little longer and enjoy a drink and maybe chat informally to the panelists amongst yourselves, to anyone that you get to chat. So thanks very much, and a final round of applause for our panelists.